Hello everyone, Susanna Anderson here from the Are They All Yours blog at StephenAndersonFamily.com. Made a video review of the book To Train Up a Child by Micheal Pearl. And I wanted to make a separate video just addressing Micheal Pearl as the person, beyond just the scope of that child training quote-unquote book. If you have not seen that video, I really recommend you view that. And if you have, you might find helpful aspects of this video as well. There are two stories I will draw on for this video. The first one is an account of the courtship between Micheal and his wife Debbie. And this is from Debbie's perspective. This is her giving the account of their courtship. And the second thing I will draw on is his account of their honeymoon. And I will read them both. They're both publicly available online. Debbie's account of their courtship is the introduction to her book on marriage written to women, created to be his helpmeet. And in this, she says, "Once upon a time, there was a silly young girl who grew up to learn what it means to be a helpmeet, God's secret for a heavenly marriage. I start this book with the words once upon a time because it really is a wonderful story come true. It should and could be your story too. It is God's gift to every woman." So being married to Micheal Pearl is God's gift to every woman. And if you could have their story, it truly is a wonderful fairy tale story. "I was a single 20-year-old girl and my pastor was a single 25-year-old hunk of a man." A single man should not be the pastor. One of the qualifications of a pastor is that he be married and have children. So he doesn't meet any of those qualifications. He's 5 years older than her. He's 25. He's pastoring. She's 20. "He had been my goal since I was 13 years old." So then, at that time, he was 18 years old. So she's 13, he's 18. We call this a sophistication disparity. He's some 18-year-old religious leader in her mind, and she's 13, and of course that would be very easy for him to exploit the feelings of this young teenager. "Although I thought that he occasionally cast his eyes at me, I had despaired of ever getting my trophy." This was during the height of the hippie revolution and the Jesus movement. The birth control pill was a new and heady thing that drove the hippies into an era of non-responsibility. AIDS was not yet a factor. The theme of the 60s was, if it feels good, do it. Young people could be seen sleeping in parks or on roadsides, switching partners as the night progressed. Drugs dulled their conscience and destroyed their dignity, but in the midst of all this sin and shame, God poured forth His Spirit and thousands of those heartsick kids began to seek God. So here we are led to believe that Micheal Pearl, the miracle worker, is leading thousands of these heartsick hippies to God through his camp meetings that he did. She talks about this revival meeting that they attended together, where throngs of used-up druggies were having some kind of a weird, charismatic-sounding conversion experience, all dropping to their knees and calling out to God, and just some weird, bizarre, charismatic-sounding experience. "In the midst of this movement of God, I felt my pastor reach over and take my hand. Talk about electric shock. I knew there was a strange and wonderful thing happening because he was ordinary, a real prude. He wouldn't even let the old ladies shake his hand after Sunday morning service. Now he was holding mine during a prayer meeting. I just knew my time had come. What kind of a freak will not shake the hands of other ladies, older ladies in the church? He just has a real need to persuade us of how righteous and godly and celibate he is. He never spoke in the hour's drive home, and I never shut up, always given to gab. I really gab when I'm nervous, and I was really nervous. Silence was so unusual for him, I thought I knew what was on his mind. Me! Finally, we pulled up to the parsonage where he lived and where my VW bug was parked. I sat in the darkness, waiting, but nothing." It's interesting that she mentions darkness here and sitting and waiting. And why is she alone with him on his parsonage? "Finally, I spoke out. You remember that boy you baptized Sunday night? The little guy who could barely see over the top of the baptistry? Well, someday I would like to give you a little boy just like that." So this is by way of introduction to a marriage book. Get alone with your single pastor in a dark parking lot and tell him how you want to have his babies. You would think that a man might take a hit, but he was out of the car and running within 2 seconds. I got out and headed for my car, figuring I might have spoken a little too boldly. I saw him as he came around his house the first time and watched as he disappeared around it again. He made 3 full laps around the large parsonage before he finally made up his mind. He rushed toward me, picked me up, and threw me into the air. At that point, I was beginning to doubt my wisdom and his sanity. Yes, you had every reason to. I wish you would have just continued doubting it. Then he said in a loud, confident voice, "Let's get married." And so we did. 8 days later, on a Sunday night, I made my way to the front of the church building, carefully stepping around the newly saved ex-hippie sitting on the floor of the crowded aisle to take the hand of my pastor husband in holy matrimony. Thus we began our journey. And with a beginning like that, what possibly could go wrong? Well, Michael doesn't leave us to wonder. He is quick to follow up with his story of the honeymoon. The story of the honeymoon can be found in the beginning of his book called Created to Need a Helpmeet. So his wife wrote the book Created to Be a Helpmeet, which was very popular. And I think Michael couldn't stand the fact that his wife had such a popular book, so he kind of had to tag on and write his own book, Written to Men, explaining to them how men are created to need a helpmeet. And he wrote this book geared at men, the marriage book from the man's perspective, basically. So here's his intro to that book, and it's the account of his honeymoon. My immediate goal in marriage was to make up for all those sexually frustrated years. The sooner the better. So his entire life up until this point, it's just all those sexually frustrated years. A friend of mine that married 2 years before I did had bragged that he was able to know his bride 5 times on their wedding night. He was a puny fellow, so I had no doubt I would beat his brag. But the truth is, 3 times is all I could muster, and just barely. So here he tells us that he was able to be with his wife 3 times on their wedding night. Now, just the fact that he tells us this is just disgusting and gross. He has a need really to brag and show us what kind of a stud he is. This is kind of like a form of exhibitionism where he wants to bring us into his bedroom. And while it is possible to talk about things pertaining to marriage or the marriage, but in somewhat neutral terms, not making it personal to yourself, what he's doing here is he's talking about himself specifically. And you will find this throughout the account. And that is what just makes it so gross and disgusting. It is possible to teach principles that apply to marriage without making it personal. So he says, he was a puny fellow, so I had no doubt I would beat his brag, but the truth is, 3 times is all I could muster. Really, he's not telling us that that's all he could muster. He's telling us, hey girls, I can do it 3 times in a row. And just barely. I quickly realized the single man's concept of marriage was a bit different than the real thing. After all, it was midnight before we got to our room, and we were up at 6 headed to the Gulf Coast, where we would honeymoon for a few days in a cottage on the beach. It was a long day's drive. We arrived at the cottage well after dark. We had brought all the gear for fishing and crabbing. That's what everyone wants to do on their honeymoon. As well as the groceries for her to prepare our meals. That way we could save a lot of money and be able to stay longer in the cabin. We dug all of the gear out of the station wagon and placed it in the cabin. Deb fixed us a big supper, after which I tried to break my record. Again, talking about his bedroom. One time, and I was asleep. I woke in the middle of the night and remembered that crabs sometimes run along the beach, so I woke Deb and excitedly said, "Let's go crabbing." My new missus complained about me not giving her enough time to find her tennis shoes. They were still packed somewhere, and I was raring to go. So here he hasn't mentioned her by name yet. He's just calling her the missus and saying how she was complaining. Anyway, I had seen her going barefoot many times. As we scurried along the beach, she complained about not having a flashlight. Again, she's mentioned as being a complainer. I was using it up ahead to scout the way and chase crabs. I heard her say something about shells hurting her feet. For the next hour or 2, I ran along the seashore and she dragged along behind carrying my crab sack. I put out some of those little round traps with bait in them, and we eventually got about 6 or 8 of the little pinching critters. Not enough for a meal. That was my first time to ever go crabbing, and I was having a ball. What more could a fellow ask for? Well, she's not a fellow. She's a woman, so maybe you could wonder about what she would like on her honeymoon. A cottage on the beach, a hot wife, again, reference to his personal life, plenty of crabs. I wouldn't call that plenty. There were 6 or 8 that you caught, not enough for a meal. This was living. We made it back to the cottage where we grabbed a couple of hours of sleep before I woke up hungry and had to make love to a woman half asleep. Don't you hate it when you just have to do that? She was willing, but not very active. He's bagging on her more in the most personal, intrusive, humiliating way. He really enjoys humiliating his wife. Afterwards, she got up and fixed us a fine breakfast. Great cook. Her mother taught her well. Well, I'm glad you tell us, Micheal Pearl, that even though she sucked in bed, she at least could cook. She wanted to go back to sleep, but I talked her into going out for more crabs. By mid-afternoon, so they just went crabbing from morning to mid-afternoon, we had a sack full of crabs and headed back to the cottage. Wow, was I tired? I told her I would just take a little nap while she prepared supper. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke to her screeching and jumping about with crabs crawling all over the cabin. This silly girl, again disparaging her, had left the sack open when she was trying to get the first crab in the huge boiling kettle. I sat up in bed and offered some constructive advice, and she had a personality change right there in front of me, and us not yet married 48 hours. Who could have imagined a female could carry on in such a crazy manner? I tried to calm her down, but she just stomped off, leaving the french fries turning black in the hot smoking oil and the crabs crawling. I yelled at her retreating form. I don't need to hunt crabs, I married one. Somehow that one remark has hung around our marriage like a ticked-off ghost. It seemed appropriate at the time. To her credit, she did come back and finish cooking. That's the only thing so far that we have heard about her credit. She can cook for him. After we ate, I was ready for some more sex. But she just wanted to sleep. I had read in a marriage book how women always have excuses, like being sleepy, having a headache, etc. There was a great sense of satisfaction when I was so completely able to change her mind. That's where he gets the satisfaction, completely changing her mind. Because, the more that she conforms to him, the more satisfying and desirable she becomes. It wasn't that difficult. She's wired right. It made me sleepy, so I dozed off again. I was just dropping off when I heard the crash. It came from the bathroom. I don't know if you watched my other video, but he has some affinity for bathrooms. She looked dead, lying there all twisted up in a weird position, half in, half out of the shower. The curtain and the rod lay flung out on the floor around her, and water was spraying everywhere. So he's asleep, convenient alibi, It reminds me of all the 911 calls where parents call and are like, I was just sleeping and I woke up and my child's gone, and the child turns up later, dead, murdered by the parent, but being asleep and taking a nap is always a convenient excuse. Well, he's asleep, and wouldn't you know it, she slips in the shower. And you're going to find out soon why he has to explain this whole story. It was one scary moment. My new bride dead on our honeymoon. I quickly turned off the water and bent to cradle her in my arms. I gently shook her while examining her injured forehead, which was quickly swelling and turning blue. What's wrong, honey? Are you sick? People don't usually, because of sickness, have a swelling, bruised, turning purple and blue forehead. That's not a sign of sickness. That's more a sign of assault and battery, of domestic violence. It sounds to me like this is the story that Micheal came up with to explain why he returned from his honeymoon with his new bride and her having this battered face. Oh, she slipped in the shower. Isn't that like the stereotypical excuse of what happened? After she opened her eyes, it took her a minute to focus, and then her expression changed. It was a mixture of pity and anger, although her voice was like a deep sigh as she whispered, You really don't know, do you? Man, it sounded like she was accusing me or something. Imagine the audacity. Since she was hurt, I let her have her say. And boy, she laid it on. Only because she was hurt did he have her let her say. Otherwise, he doesn't care what she thinks, let alone what she has to say. She sat up, pulling herself away from me, turning where she could look me square in the face. The gist of what she said was something along these lines. So here we are to believe that she goes off on this diatribe right after passing out, slipping in the shower. She's so tired, she passes out in the shower, falls, falls, hits her head, pulls the curtain down, the rod, her face is all battered and bruised. She goes unconscious, but she comes to, and this is the speech she gives. In the last 48 hours, I haven't slept more than 2 hours undisturbed. My feet have 20 or more tiny holes in them because you wouldn't let me take an extra 5 minutes to unpack my tennis shoes. My shoulder is sore from trying to carry 30 pounds of crabs for hours. They didn't weigh that much. My hand is burned from trying to stuff a fighting crab into a kettle of boiling water, which seems very much like torturing the poor thing, and all the while you lay in a state of repose. Due to lack of sleep and sun, my eyes feel like they're full of sand. I have had little to eat. I'm female for crying out loud. I just want to sleep without you pawing on me. Besides, I have body parts I didn't even know existed until now, and they are killing me. So what is wrong with me? I'm the weaker vessel. Remember, it's in the Bible, chapter 1, verse 1, or somewhere. That's what we all say when we just, passed out in the shower, hit our head, and came unconscious. Strange creatures, these females. My brother never acted like that when we traveled together, holding evangelistic services. Well, she will get adjusted, I thought. That's because that's the only person that needs adjusting. It's her that needs to get adjusted. It's not Michael and his insane expectations. So there you have it, folks. The story of the Pearls, Courtship and Honeymoon. And it seems like things only went downhill from there. This is just to show you more of why I believe Micheal Pearl is just weird and sick and twisted in the head. And I think there's definite signs and markers of assault and battery in this whole weird bathroom incident that he's trying to gloss over and explain. I see indications of that in his language. Of course, I have no way of proving that. You can read it for yourself and walk away with your own conclusions. I strongly warn anyone against the teachings of Micheal Pearl and No Greater Joy Ministries. Thank you for watching.